My ancestral name is Dacia. I'm a member of the Cooks Ferry Band of the Ntlaka'pamux Nation, and I am here to speak to you today on working with industry, and specifically introduction to joint ventures. You'll notice in the program tomorrow you have another presentation on joint venture mechanics, the machinery of them. So this is an introduction to that topic for tomorrow. Joint ventures have been happening across the country for hundreds of years with our people and among non-Aboriginal people as well. And so what we're going to do today is just go through 3 steps as part of an introduction to the concept and how First Nations are using them, but more importantly, why they're used and how to make them successful. All of our communities, it doesn't matter where you are in the province, have been approached by some industry somewhere and have asked for consultation at the least point, some sort of engagement at the highest point. And everywhere along there in engaging a community are the differences. You heard that in the last presentation about how communities, how we think about things collectively, how those present challenges to outside companies, and how outside companies present challenges to our communities in setting up engagements between the two. So I know it's been a long day, and we're at the end of the 7th inning here, but there's 3 sections to my presentation. And we're going to go through, number 1, why joint ventures, 2, First Nations examples, where they're happening now across the country, and the 3rd, to end us today, will be how to initiate the planning for a joint venture to be successful. Some of you have done this already. I know from some of you in communities who have joint ventures, you already know this. Others will be not. This will be new. So we'll start off as a very intro and then move to initiating at the end. So, why joint ventures? In many situations, you've been at your community and you've looked out across your land or your people or your resources, or you're an elected official and you've got your community coming to you and wanting solutions to jobs, investment, facilities. So you've got an idea. So how do you make that happen? We are all from communities who are capacity restrained or at times capital restrained. Something's missing. So let's just use some examples of what would happen if you're in a community. You're in a community that just happens to have a lot of water. You've got the possibility, looking at a river going by your community, thinking, wait a minute, that could be a clean energy source. So you've got the water. You look around beyond the water and you've got, lo and behold, hydro towers. You can get this stuff to market. All you need now is to build a clean run-of-river facility, which is safe for the environment, generates revenue for your community. What's stopping you? You've got the water. You've got the hydro access to get it out to market. But that last piece, a run-of-river facility can cost tens of millions of dollars. And on top of that, do you have electrical, construction, financial engineers or specialists in your community? You're missing a piece. This is where the joint venture comes into play. A joint venture will bring a capacity to you, if chosen correctly, that you do not have in-house. And it can go for a number of industries. My community, for example, and many of yours, have an abundance of forest resources. Some of our communities as well have access to rail lines, either in the northern corridor or ones down through the canyon here to the coast. So you think, we got the forestry, we've got the people, we've got access to markets. What are we missing? The plant, the facilities. In this case, it's a biomass pellet machine, something I have a lot of experience with, and the experience I have is not having the capital to buy the pelleting machines. So it's the same situation. You've got 2 of the pieces needed for a project. You've got your lumber, you've got your access, where do you get your capital, and the talent, the capacity to run the facility. So this happens not only in industry and business, it happens in a lot of other places. I'll talk about entertainment for a minute. But what you're looking at here is that you have got the pieces, 3 of the 4, or maybe 2 of the 4, but you're missing an essential component. In many cases, it's too expensive to go out and buy that. It's almost impossible to do that because you haven't got the capital, or the people who provide that facility aren't interested in selling it. They want to be part of it. So you have an opportunity. Now, when I talked about this earlier, you've got 2 or 3 of the pieces. That missing piece is what you're after. And how you find that or how you engage that will result in a possible success or failure of the enterprise. Now, in our communities, it's vitally important that we do not fail because it's so expensive to fail in cases of large capital projects. We now have situations on the LNG pipelines that are being proposed across our territories of them wanting partnerships. But, as you'll see here, the best and successful partnerships will happen when the First Nations identifies what its purpose is to itself first and not let industry drive it, because industry does not have the same values that we have. And that was presented very carefully last time, in the last presentation. So that missing piece is the partnership you're after. And it's important to identify what that piece is and know the parameters of how far you will go as a community in seeking out that partnership. There are many ways to do that, but the most common one used is the joint venture. So I want to share with you, we have all seen partnerships work from the earliest ages of our youth. Our kids see it, and it's in this.
Ernie, tell me, how do I look?
With your eyes, Bert.
A partnership is not complicated. If the alignment between the purposes of the two parties is in sync, it will be a success. This is a very basic example. An early example, teaching children, Bert and Ernie. Can you imagine Bert going off for a solo career by himself? No. It's a combination that works because the purposes are aligned. Let's look at something a little more recent, because this is a long time ago. This.
Chewie, we're home.
If you've got a 7-year-old or a 13-year-old right now, like I do, my house is nothing but Star Wars. This, the union of two characters who are in our combined cultures, native, non-native right now, in deep. The partnership of Han Solo and Chewbacca, again, in the storyline, is about two rogues in partnership, unified with a purpose. Now, there's nothing that could tear that apart, right? My kids pointed this out yesterday. It did fall apart. But outside of that, if this partnership had been anyone else, would it work? Can you imagine this? Han Solo and Ernie gallivanting through the universe, looting and pillaging. No. The purposes are misaligned. And it's that is the key to this presentation, is as a First Nation going into any partnership, alignment has to be.
Very bad feeling about this.
Otherwise, you're going to have a bad feeling about your engagement in a joint venture partner. So, purpose. If the purpose is not aligned, there is going to be a problem in an engagement in a joint venture partner. And I stress this right up front, and I'll get it again, is because 70% of joint ventures fail. And the reason joint ventures fail, almost 70% of the time, is that there is a misalignment of purpose. A successful joint venture increases mutual value for both parties. It is something that benefits both sides. And in order to ensure it's successful, you must understand from a community what your values are at the forefront going into the relationship. Because generally, when an industry is coming to you, it is not as complex as a community. They may just see it as shareholder value. They got to get a pipe built. That's it. We as communities have to care for our chaos, our culture, our traditions, our elders in a communal sense, and it's much more complicated. So the successful First Nation engagements with joint venture partners have happened best when the First Nation knows going in what it stands for. So one thing to stress here, value is not just money. There are two ways to look at value. A value can be anything that both parties or either party deems of value. And in the joint venture language of this, the two terms is economic value or intrinsic value. And this is very important. Most companies coming to you to do a joint venture are generally on the economic value side. But we as First Nations have intrinsic values which we hold just as important, if not more important, than economic or money. So just to go through this, what do you think this would represent? What type of value would that, a logging operation, represent? Economic. It's an economic transaction. It's an economic value that's being enacted by through a joint venture. What about this? What would that be? This is intrinsic. It's important for many of us in First Nations to ensure that our lands are protected or that parts of the land are not harmed by industry. This is an intrinsic value. This is something of value to us as a community. Important to state going into a negotiation on a joint venture. What about something like that? A cultural practice. It could be both, but in this case I'm going to call it just intrinsic because we're not selling the fish. This is me and my community. We're harvesting fish for elders. But in our community values, this is important. Going into a joint venture negotiation with a company that wants to use our land base, this is something that we have to take into account in knowing what our values are going into the negotiation. Just to repeat, joint ventures are about increasing value, no matter how you state it. Are you improving the economic or the intrinsic, or are you doing both? And successful engagements with First Nations have taken into account both of those. The nation knows what it wants out of the negotiation. It knows what it wants out of the joint venture partner. And, counterwise, the joint venture partner understands that the intrinsic values are just as important to the community. And successful partnerships will respect that. Some First Nations examples. Going through, joint ventures happen around the world. They're not unique to the world, but I'm just going to focus on North America right now, and specifically those with First Nations in Canada. Starting in the East Coast. If you look at just some examples, and there are hundreds of them, I could not put them all on a slide, starting with, this is member 2. Which is in Nova Scotia and Cape Breton Island. Been phenomenally successful. In this case, a convention center, but they also have land development. They're doing light industry. They have taken the approach of engaging outside companies to transfer skills, provide capital, but they hire their own people. They have a very well-defined set of what their intrinsic values are and what their economic values are. They've translated those to goals, and they've implemented it in Nova Scotia. Other examples. There are joint ventures in Iqaluit with the Inuvialuit, and what they have done is have fuel delivery businesses that deliver fuel to mining and commercial operations throughout their territories. Again, same concept. They understood what they wanted and they acted on it. There are other examples. Construction in Sault Ste. Marie. Engineering, this is Thunder Bay, the Thunder Bay First Nation. They provide services to mines in their area. Again, joint ventures with commercial operations that they can then put into practice to provide for their people in jobs, employment, training. Camp services, a big business out of Edmonton. There's a number of businesses around the oil sands right now that provide First Nations in concert with a number of companies to provide those services outside. The condition, they use their own people first. Many of these companies have gotten to the point where they're starting to employ outside non-native people because they've run out of their own people. Again, when you go through the examples, they again have identified what's important to them and how far they will go in their partnership. The Suyas, we hear this often in the vineyards with Vincor, the training, the bottling, the distribution of wines from the vineyards, same thing. A joint venture partner who provided that missing piece that the First Nation did not have. They had many of the pieces already, but they needed those key parts in a joint venture. Clean power. How do you say this? Pitchison. This is Yuda Sayer's group, and Ucluelet is part of this as well. The same thing, that clean energy. They had the water resources, they had the people. What they needed was the money and the engineering talent to help them build the actual facility. There's one thing that doesn't come up very often in the media on what First Nations hold in these negotiations as well, and that's our inherent rights. In many cases, none of these will happen unless the First Nations are on board. And in negotiations, in your seeking the idea of finding a joint venture partner, many of those companies are well aware of that. And it is a card that we hold in placing negotiations on these projects. So again, you need all the pieces. Just got to find that one. If you're looking for a joint venture project, it is in our interest, your interest, to simply focus on that one piece. Not a blanket blanket negotiation, but the one piece that's missing. All of those examples I showed you have similar. They had a lot of the pieces already. They just needed that one thing to get them over the hump. There's not one way to do these, so you can't have someone come in and give you a template on how to do them because every situation is different. Every community will have different resources. Every community will have a different set of values and goals and purposes, many of them intrinsic, which cannot be duplicated from project to project. So this goes the other way as well. You're starting to see these companies, especially here in our territories in British Columbia, come forward and seek our help because they cannot generally get these projects done without having some First Nation involvement, either to avoid litigation or simply to deal with the larger government regulations where First Nations must be involved in somehow, in some area. That certainty card is something that is very much foremost in the largest capital projects right now happening across the country. In the research when I was doing this, you had some companies now quite blatant, knowing that they, as an individual company, could not go deal with the major energy companies or the mining companies directly because those companies have made commitments to First Nations in their area first. So the only way that these companies can get in, smaller companies, service companies, to large operations, is with a First Nations partner. But for that to be an equitable relationship, the First Nation has to know what its values are going into that negotiation. So how to initiate these deals? When you're preparing for a joint venture, and I've stressed this 5 or 6 times already, you must know your values. How many times have you been in a council meeting where people talk in generalities about what the group or the community wants, but it isn't actually nailed down? And what that does is it fractures us internally. And then how do we go to an outside party and present a unified front? Or what happens if we're fractured internally and we go to the other party and the other party thinks we said that? That relationship is going to split. And that will cause a loss of capital, loss of face, loss of political capital. So it's important to know your values. Those will inform your purpose in going to a joint venture. So you define what the purpose is based on your values. Economic versus intrinsic. As First Nations, we have the intrinsic values built in, and we cannot sell those out without harming our community, our collective. So those have to be part of the discussions. Companies now that are good partners for joint ventures will understand that and will take that into account. What's your objective? If you're a First Nation looking to do a clean power facility and you know you need a partner for capital, but you've got the rest of it, then that's what your negotiations should prepare for. Don't get sidelined by everything else coming from the other side because you know what you're after to meet your objectives. And if you want an upfront partner, they have to know what you're after. And know your value. Know what you offer the other side. In many cases right now, we've seen this with LNG facilities, they need us on side. Other things will happen in forestry or mining or any land use at the moment. First Nations are key to approvals through regulatory systems. That is what we offer. It is a risk mitigation strategy for the other side, for the companies, but it is a value that they desire and require and will not be able to get from anyone else. So keep that in mind. Also keep in mind what you offer in terms of any other elements of the project. Labor. We have lots of labor. If you need training, great, know the parameters of it. Again, the most successful First Nations joint ventures have happened when the First Nations drives that discussion early. Research. Google. There's an amazing amount of information out there. If you go online, I'm going to give you just an example now, just thinking, okay, what is involved in actually setting out the paperwork for a joint venture? If any of you are from Terrace, you may have seen this. Terrace, the Economic Development Corporation, this is Terrace, not the First Nations there, have developed a toolkit. And this is online. If you go online, it has all those agreements in there, templates ready to go. Also on Google, if you go out, you'll find other First Nations to see what they have done in probably very similar situations, because other First Nations across the country, somebody has done what you're trying to do already. And in our case, just as a sideline, is that I am a trustee on our Sovereign Wealth Fund for a mining project in our territory. We revenue share on a mining project. When we were setting that up, I went onto Google, and we could not figure out how much we should be asking for. Because in the agreements with First Nations, generally, they're private. They're not disclosed. It's very hard to get an agreement from a mine or another First Nation. But if you go on Google, somebody has posted something they shouldn't have on Facebook somewhere. So at one point, we found all the numbers on somebody's Facebook page from a First Nation of the Northwest Territory. It's amazing what you can find if you can play Google. Use it. Because you know what? The companies will be doing the same thing the other way. I'll share with you as well is that when I was doing the research for this, there are amazing presentations from law firms across the country on exactly how to set up joint ventures. What has worked for First Nations, and more importantly, what has not. So use it. It's a resource. Google. Call other First Nations. If you're looking at a joint venture program to do something on construction or on mining engineering or something, somebody has done one already. And we are all family. We are more family with First Nations in Ontario at times than we are with our neighboring First Nation, but it is a resource. And if you phone politely, tell them what you're doing, 90% of the time, they will share their information with you about what worked, what didn't, if they had to do it again, how they would do it. It's a resource. And First Nations will share that generally. Once you've done that, and you've already got down your purpose, your community, what it will accept and not accept, you've done your networking to find out what the parameters are available are, go meet companies. There's no harm in meeting companies to see what they offer, and best of all, if you've already defined your values, both intrinsic and economic, you want a partner who will respect those. And the way to do that is to go meet them and share your values. This is proactive on the First Nations part, though, as opposed to waiting for the companies to come. Because the companies that come may or may not share your values. And most, very important, is it a good fit? Does the First Nations, does the company fit with your First Nation? If the company is certainly hell-bent on their one solution, and that's it, and I won't use names because we've had to deal with them in our company, in our First Nation, it's not a good fit. Are they compatible with your values? Are they compatible with your community? Are they respectful of your traditions? Very important. Only after you've done all that are you ready to start any process of an agreement with a company. That starts generally with a letter of intent, but that's it at that point. It's just an agreement that you're going to talk further. Because after that, you start a lot of pieces to actually decide on the mechanics. So that was all about how to prepare for one. Once you're actually going to go move into one, then the decisions about the nuts and bolts of the agreement start. The big one is how far does the agreement go? Is the agreement going to be for 20 years on all development in the territory? Is it going to be for the powerhouse of the clean power facility? Is it going to be just for the piece of things and then your exit clausing? Decide where you want to go with that. The cards, the resources you bring have value to the other party. Remember that. Define how far you wish to go as a First Nation. The structure of a joint venture. Is it a new company, completely new company that's going to be set up? You can do a partnership, or you're just going to do a contract for that one thing that you want to go into partnership with. When you're thinking about that, remember that a new company requires officers and staff. It requires a lot more outlay and a lot more involvement from a First Nation, which you may or may not have the interest in doing. But if not, a partnership or contract are much simpler and more streamlined. A partnership also allows separate identities. You are not looking at a merger, because the last thing you want for a First Nation is to become corporately merged with some company based in Toronto or London or Chicago. You are still your own entity. A joint venture partner will generally not want to become an Indian band somewhere in British Columbia. But just keep that in mind. It's not all your eggs in one basket. It's just that part of the project you're after. Decide on the term. You're going to do it to one project, end, and then continue on? Or are you doing a long-term relationship? This affects the relationship. It also affects how much political capital you have to spend selling this to your own community. And be realistic about the risks. 70% of these ventures will fail. The number one reason why they fail is usually a communication problem on purposes, which is tied to values. So it's important to get that clear right up front. It's also clear, it's important to remember what the other party is bringing into this. They have their own concerns as well. But be realistic about what is coming up. After you've gone through that, you're ready to enter a legal agreement. And legal agreements, as I pointed out, can be found online if you just want to take a look and see what they look like. But these are legally binding partnerships, so you will have to go through a legal system to do that. You'll hear about the mechanics of that tomorrow in the presentation, but this is what's needed to set up for those negotiations. So, when you're going in, here are the key points. Again, 7th time, know your values. We, at times, get into groupthink if you're in an Aboriginal community. You think everybody's thinking the same. And you see what happens in council meetings when that happens. It's not always implicit in people's group behavior. Put it on paper. What are the values vis-a-vis this project or the project you're looking at? Know where your intrinsic values are and your economic values and how far you will go in the joint venture with that. It will save you a lot of hassles later. It will also save a lot of hassles for your partner. Know what you are after. Is this only about capital and they will do nothing else? Is it about training? Expectations of what's involved in the partnership can go sideways very quickly unless it's very clear. And our collective is probably the hardest group to negotiate with. Make sure the community and you understand what's on the table and what you're expecting. Google. Love Google. Go through it, fine-tooth comb. Try everything you can think of in terms of word combinations, in terms of projects, in terms of people, in terms of First Nations, in terms of environment, anything. You will find valuable information, and it will inform you onto what you should look for. It will also inform you if a company that you're looking at to engage with are idiots in another province. Have they been idiots to First Nations somewhere else? You will be able to find out. It could be defamation if they actually said that up to you up front, but guess what? Somebody's said something on Facebook they shouldn't have, and you can track it down. Know your value to the other party. If a First Nations wants to come and cross your territory and you're smack in the middle of the valley, can they go to another party? No. Know that. Know that you do have the labor force. You do have the water. You do have something. Know what that value is to the other party. And be realistic about it. And last point, good joint ventures increase value. The idea in a negotiation is to increase the size of the pie so that you get the bigger piece of the pie. A bad joint venture destroys value, and it goes the other way. And who wants a shrinking pie? So that is the pieces in prep for the conversation tomorrow when you actually go into the mechanics of what comes next in setting up the joint venture. You've already gone through the process of knowing you need one. You've identified what your values are. You've identified what your need is. And now you move to actually putting it together. Any questions?
might be answering this, or someone might be answering it tomorrow, but first and foremost, thank you very much. Good presentation. I really liked all the visuals. I do have a question with regards to joint venture penalties. So there was a question raised earlier this morning. For those communities that do go into a partnership agreement and they have a partner who doesn't realize or fulfill or is doesn't adhere to their agreement in terms of producing predetermined jobs, employment, training, contracts, whatever those things are, usually there aren't financial penalties attached. And I know that a lot of lawyers are saying attach financial penalties to ensure adherence. That is also so negatively construed by First Nations and or the joint venture partner. Are there other mechanisms that you've seen or used to be able to help support compliance with those kinds of outcomes that are requested by First Nations?
I'm going to differ a bit on you. I don't see a problem of having those penalties in place because it is a contractual agreement. It is a legal contractual business arrangement. And there are penalties in that case. If you don't pay your credit card by the 15th of the month, there's a penalty. I would have the penalty in there. Or you'd have some other remediation in there. So if that partner hasn't delivered, it's costing your community money. It's costing your community time. You could have a partner who could have it completed. So I would say have the penalties in there. The one thing about joint venture agreements, there's no template. You can do whatever you want. You could have anything in there at all. And, I know there are lawyers in the room, you should start with your purpose first. What's the value? What are you trying to do first? Not the legal template. Start with that and have the legal back that up. Because the legal system should enable us to achieve our values, not the other way around. It's very colonial the other way around.
Agreed. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. When I'm the fortunate enough to know and understand a bit of your background, and I thought for the audience today specifically, how do we know when a community is ready to enter into a joint venture? Or how do you help your community understand that they don't need to own 100% of the business to be successful? And I know you pointed out, know your gap, but I also know we work in communities that think like how, so you talked about it, but how do you get that community ready? And so that might help some of the leadership here. Thank you.
There's two ways to approach that. Some of these examples was interesting in Northern Ontario had set themselves up. It's clear when I saw the agreement, it was interesting. The First Nation owns 99% of the entity, but they have a revenue sharing deal of 50% with the company. So they have clearly, what they've done is they've presented it to their community as we own all of this, they're just 1%. But then the side deal is the community, they still pay out 50%. That's one way to get around that. It was fascinating to see. I've never seen it in agreement that way. The other side is to take the time to educate your community about how these things work. Because you're right, it's a culture clash from a capitalist sense to a communal sense to try and get the two to mesh. And sometimes they don't. They just won't. And sometimes, if you go through this process, the community may decide, no, we are not going to bend on any of our intrinsic values, and this just isn't going to work. It's better to know that up front before you go out and start the engagement with a company and have that come out 2 years down the road. Because those penalties could go the other way against the community. So, one, education. It's unique for every community. Second, set it up in such a way that the community owns 100%, but you have another way of remediating or remunerating the company agreement. And a company who understands how a First Nation works and understands those values will accept that. Because sometimes, the companies I have dealt with at times, how many of you have been in a situation where you're educating the company about what it means to be a First Nations person right from the beginning in a discussion, and you're sitting there going, oh, the Indian Act, okay, it was passed in 1867, it means this, we are wards of the Crown, blah, 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 blah. And then that's not a good match. I know you've all had to do that at times. Why don't we pay tax? Well, it's the Crown.
Hello, Mark. Sam Schooner from Newcock Nation. I'm just wondering, like, before this actually gets to the table, for an agreement or a joint venture or a user agreement or whatever you name it. I'm just wondering about like what stops industry from coming in and just grabbing individuals from your nation to go into joint adventure? I'm not sure if there's laws that actually protect the nation, because I know individual people that are approached, they can get misled, right? So I'm just wondering if there's anything that stops industry from coming in to do such practices.
There's nothing to stop an industry from doing that to an individual. Say in your community you've got 3 people who own some equipment, and then they joint venture with the company to do services on behalf of the company on a project that has not been approved by chief and council or the government, the First Nations government. Nothing to stop that. What is going to be a problem, though, for the company is that if they're going to do something and consultation has to happen, or there has to be some accommodation, or at least concurrence from the First Nation, they're not going to get it from those 3 individuals. So it happens. There's no way to stop it, but it's not necessarily in the interest of the company. Again, this comes back to the questions about how does a community educate its members about where it stands. It's the challenge of a communal versus a capitalist, or in this case, a corporate structure. It's a challenge for all of us. I hope that's not a clear answer. It happens to all of us. The one thing I would put forward is that that company is not going to get the concurrence they wish from the First Nations government by doing that directly. They may or may not, depending how it works, but it's very adversarial. We've had that happen in our community at times. And then those 3 individuals in a chief and council or in a First Nations government meeting will support the company. It's in their interest to do so. Is that the interest of everyone as a collective? It's that rub between the commercial and the corporate, commercial and community.